For a long while, I never bothered paying attention to movies, but around the start of last year, I finally had the balls to watch Midsummer, the most empowering girl power movie since Gone Girl. At that point, I couldn't help but indulge a little bit more into watching films, finally understanding what the terms giallo and A24 mean, as well as being the instigator for a happy marriage between my Google search results in 1 to 3 movies. It just so happened that the one year that I started caring about films, the year was literally incapable of meeting me halfway, almost as if fate turned its nose up at me and said, it's too late to apologize. 2020 may have clogged the toilet and hit full flush 8 times, and all of us dealt with the consequences, but I still gave it a good shot, and attempting to keep up to date with movies has equipped me with the knowledge to compile 2 hand-in-hand lists about the 6 best and 6 worst films from 2020 that I saw. In the midst of the world shitting itself through a pandemic, even just the concept of possibly dying tomorrow is troubling alone. Some of my biggest fears are inherited from talking to other people about what their own fears are. If you brought the idea of looming death into a group conversation, suddenly it's on everyone's mind. Everyone drinks from the same thought bubble, which probably isn't too hygienic either. Here we have She Dies Tomorrow, a movie about a girl who is struck with the feeling that she might die tomorrow, which ends up spreading from person to person around her until even the dude from TV on the radio is doom-stricken. It's a fairly updated take on Lars von Trier's Melancholia, an achingly slow film with no real plot, other than to see each character begin to see reminders of their existential fear in the everyday corners of their house. But I really do mean achingly slow. After the first 10 minutes, it becomes clear that this film is bogged up in being ambiguous without actually being interesting enough in the first place for me to care what any of it even means. My attention span takes a skiing trip down the slope of disinterest, but even when it reaches what should have been the end, it just keeps sliding on and on and on and on. It is fair to have a skepticism for Netflix originals, and although it really is just a sage stick-scented version of Jeff Nichols' 2011 film Take Shelter, Horse Girl is a pretty effectively heartbreaking and eerie movie about schizophrenia and derealization. It so badly wants to be an art house movie and never fully commits, but who cares, I'd prefer that over something more everyday. That said, the most impressive part is managing to get something good out of Debbie Ryan for even a few minutes. I wouldn't really say that the director Mick G, whose name resembles the brand of some kind of power tools kit, is known for puritanical, well-mannered behaviour. His movies are fairly crude, and let's not bullshit with this word here, stupid. But The Babysitter from a few years ago, a movie about a kid whose babysitter is not only friends with Bella Thorne and King Batch, but also planning to sacrifice him in a satanic ritual, was fun because it didn't hate that it was a silly movie. It sort of unashamedly was what it was. But as with many things, from Lil Yachty to the Wendy's Twitter account, when you start being in on the joke, you kinda shoot yourself in the foot and actually stop being any more fun. The Babysitter Killer Queen is a sequel that straight up copy-pastes gags from the original, writes some new gags that try way too hard, and then tries to expand the universe sequel style with lore and backstory, and then plops the whole movie in a vague and boring location, like a child that's just lost their dollhouse and has to use the living room floor instead. On my 21st birthday a couple weeks ago, I downed a yard glass full of Cody's. It's a horrible idea and you should never do it, but it's a bloody good story to tell, a yarn that becomes the 3rd most important thing that you can carry with you, next to your FPOS card and a stick of lip balm. Living in New Zealand, drinking culture is such an integral part of parasocial relationships. You get called a good cunt for being able to sink piss, and an even gooder cunt for not being able to sink piss, but still doing it. This double-edged sword of alcohol consumption is the basis for the Danish film Another Round, revolving around 4 teachers with lives, careers, and marriages, boring enough to make Bibi Rexha look like Grace Jones. They get on the piss and decide to let their blood alcohol level drive excitement and character and colour back into their lives again, which of course eventually reaches the kind of result you might expect from anybody developing a reliance on alcohol to keep themselves satisfied. What you should expect is Mad Mikkelsen being a fucking god, but what you might not expect is how quiet it is, allowing you to properly engage with what it means to be involved in a drinking culture, especially if you're a goddamn father. It's more meditative than you might think it'd be, but it deserves that. You can't hide a wolf in sheep's clothing. A Will Ferrell comedy is still a Will Ferrell comedy, even if you have Rachel McAdams alongside him to balance it all out. I don't really have much to say about Eurovision Song Contest, The Story of Fire Saga. It's the sort of big-budget comedy flick where every joke is one genre. The characters are Icelandic. Ooh, let's play Sigur Rós. That and its 2 whole-ass hours, I think that's a real kicker here. The only thing more devastating than Will Ferrell pretending that he's Icelandic is realizing you're going to need to witness it for the length of Blue Velvet. The amount of people who claim you couldn't make a movie like Borat these days just shat themselves when the goddamn sequel came out in 2020. Not only was it good, but Well, fuck, it was good, wasn't it? I feel like I don't need to tell you this. If you know, you've probably already seen it. But a fair amount of the gags are cleverly and eerily timely, despite the fact that most of them are preaching to the choir a bit. I mean, if you were interested in Borat 2 in the first place, I can't imagine you being surprised that these snapshots of an American wasteland are American and wastelandish. But I do think the star of the show is Maria Bakalova, being introduced as Borat's daughter, meaning that the narrative doesn't grow stale and actually feels like a bold passing of the torch. Adequately decent. I haven't read the book Stargirl, but I'd like to think that the character building wasn't actually as thin as mechanical pencil lead. Casting a Gen Z Michael Cera, and that girl who won America's Got Talent by singing in cursive with ukulele, which she also gets the chance to do several times in this movie, I am overhating a little bit. It's a relatively harmless teen movie if you have it described to you, but actually watching it is a surreal experience. I guess you could call it a manic pixie fever dream. The sources of conflict in this movie are just absurd, the character motives make no sense, and it barely helps that Stargirl herself is somehow a forgettable character in her own movie. Coming out of believing that BlacKkKlansman was a waste of time, I still thought and do think Spike Lee is a fucking one-of-a-kind director whose most flawed films are actually just a result of him having so many ideas and not enough luggage space to carry them. The Five Bloods grants him that space at last. It's a film that adopts one of the most humanistic and honest portrayals of during war and post-war Vietnam, even while adopting the black American perspective that it does. So many images and ideas have seared themselves into my brain: the commercialization of the Apocalypse Now nightclub, the white charity workers who cower when shit hits the fan, the depiction of age during each flashback sequence, the images and videos that appear on screen to remind you that these scenes aren't just scenes, they resemble a real war with real consequences in a very, very real world. Listen, do drugs if you want to, but don't let bloody Sting be the one that validates you taking acid one day, just because he took shrooms on a farm and helped a cow give birth. Have a Nice Trip, Adventures in Psychedelics was a documentary that hit Netflix, but it's essentially one massive SNL sketch, disguised as an informative take on acid. They essentially have to gather people's interest by having most of the documentary be celebrities telling you stories about their experiences with acid, which is probably one of the most limp-willy directions they could have taken with this, especially because none of them are even good storytellers either, rattling off some vague shit about how everything is connected or you get your ego knocked down a peg. Like, not everyone uses Reddit, bro. We don't all know what that means, but instead we get told the same trip story 50 times by people with higher net worths than me. It's a film where either the Workaholics cast is whimsically reenacting Anthony Bourdain's genuinely horrific tales of a woman's overdosage, or Rosie Perez is telling stories about her trip with the storytelling proficiency of a dried parsnip. It's gotta mean something when the central scene of a movie hits, where the meaning of the film's title suddenly becomes clear, and then you begin to bawl your eyes out. I can name a couple examples. There's the Kevin Smith movie Tusk, of course, but then there's also Never Really, Sometimes Always, a movie about a young girl who needs to travel to New York with her cousin to have an abortion. It is a conceptually simple film, so simple that all the power here lies in body gesture and facial expression. In fact, the most important quote of the film isn't a quote, it is instead the image of hands being held, but it speaks more than words ever could in that moment. Silence itself becomes a language, and you don't always need a verbal answer to understand that message. I promise I'm not doing this to piss anybody off, but my least favourite film of the year happens to be a lot of people's most treasured film too. I just want to take this moment to lay a hand on your shoulder and mutter into your ear that I understand, and then mutter into the other one, but I do have to be honest, buddy. Charlie Kaufman went full Charlie Kaufman mode on I'm Thinking of Ending Things, a movie I couldn't have been more excited for since I was once 16 years old and considered Synecdoche, New York to be my favourite movie of all time. But more importantly, I think Kaufman's fairly self-centered, troubled genius narrative tends to get in the way of me enjoying his movies, no matter how genuine the grief-strickenness is. I'm Thinking of Ending Things is a confusing film, but that's not the problem. It's that it's boring and confusing, so I never really got a chance to care about what any of this solipsistic jumble even meant. The movie begins with Jessie Buckley coming over for dinner at her boyfriend Jesse Plemons' parents' house, and if Jesse Plemons' presence alone wasn't enough of a blatant sign that the story is going to go topsy-turvy, eventually everybody begins speaking as if they're all part of the same brain, most likely his brain, because sentences get cut off like when you're trying to snap yourself out of an intrusive thought, and then what feels like a third of the movie is taken up by this big road trip where the characters ramble on about film nerd shit. It could be tongue-in-cheek and it could be cool, but yes, well see, The film really acts like it's winding you up for some big self-aware punchline that never actually comes, only eats at you like worms to a rotting pig. It borders on a very snarky self-parody, but then sneers at the audience for not being able to decipher what's going on, as if Charlie Kaufman gets why people hate him and then wants to show that, and then get on a bit of the action too. It smacks of both pretension and insecurity at the same time, like trying to 69 yourself. It never really says anything, just sort of hints at things that it very possibly could be saying, and then gets carried away by the last 40 minutes, which is a bit embarrassing. That's like putting nothing on a plate and then garnishing it with chopped almonds. Kajillionaire, directed by Miranda July, is my favourite film of 2020, somewhere between the emotional dissonance of punch-drunk love and the deadpan familial pain of the Royal Tenenbaums, but ultimately being just a Miranda July film. July's writing tends to have such a vital humanity, despite how fucking absurd it ends up being, but her detractors, her haters, who call it being quirky for the sake of being quirky, probably don't yet realise how grounded in the human spirit it really is. We're all fucking weird and we're annoying and we're incomplete people. A young girl whose name we don't even know for most of the movie lives with her manipulative parents who try to heist and scam money to pay off the rent for their tiny, risky household that isn't really a household. Amid what seems like a complete lack of compassion is a surprising flood of compassion, you might find. Not only the cartoonishly whimsical imagery, but also the few ambiguous and absurd moments that are passed off in this movie as if they're just things that could regularly occur in the real world, as if to say that the love that our protagonist wants to receive is just as alien. But it's exactly that which leads to the movie's most moving payoff. Kajillionaire is a tender, beautiful, heartwarming film with a true punch of an ending, a performance high for Evan Rachel Wood, and a score that sounds like the musical equivalent of your mum unveiling a frosted carrot cake.
I can do it, boys. Let's go.